Okay, so we're going to look at Henry's consolidation of power with a focus on retaining. And there's two key questions there for you to think about, which should help you develop your analysis as you go through. Firstly, how successfully did Henry deal with retaining? And secondly, did it help Henry fulfill his aims, and how? So one of the most serious problems that late medieval kings had to contend with was that of illegal retaining. This was a common practice whereby great lords recruited those of a lesser status as their servants or followers to help them try and advance their own affairs and to increase their status. Members of the armies were given a uniform on which there was the master's crest or coat of arms showing exactly who they were serving. Now, why did this exist in the first place? Well, kings had permitted and allowed this practice to exist because it would help provide a quick and efficient way of raising an army if a king needed it. However, the recent civil wars had shown that these retainers could also create lawlessness at both local and national levels and could be used as an effective force against the king. So, under Edward's Parliament of 1468, a statute had been passed which prohibited retaining except for domestic servants, state officials and legal advisors. However, this law was largely ineffectual because it allowed the continued use of retaining for, quote, lawful service. And therefore, during Edward's reign, nobles continued to use retaining using the excuse that we're doing so within the existing framework of the law. So essentially, they used this clause about lawful service as a loophole to continue retaining. Historians now conclude that Edward intended this statute merely as a way to soothe fears in House of Commons rather than with the intention of dealing and adhering to preventing retaining properly. So Henry VII openly condemned retaining at the beginning of his reign, and two laws were passed against it, firstly in 1487 and then in 1504. But historians have differed in their opinions of the king's real attitude towards the practice of retaining. Originally, they identified this as one of Henry's most innovative policies. However, as more research was undertaken into the 15th century, it appeared that he was merely continuing what he understood to be the policy of his Yorkist predecessor. So this idea that he was restraining rather than attempting to eliminate retaining altogether. In 1486, it was the Earl of Northumberland's force that rescued the king from the ambush in Yorkshire, and the army that he led across the Channel to France in 1492 was raised from many of his lord's private armies, therefore showing in some cases retaining actually helped Henry and strengthened him. Some historians also look at the wording of Henry's statutes against retaining and use this to show that he did not really intend to stop the practice of retaining completely. However, more up-to-date research now concludes that Henry's attitude towards retaining was actually quite different. Historians who put forward this argument begin by referring to the first months of his reign, where the king forced the members of both houses of Parliament to swear that they would not retain illegally. Also, although Henry's statute of 1487 seemed to echo Edward's and seemed to be similar in a continuity, Henry paid far greater attention to the actual interpretation of the law, and the loophole that we referred to earlier over lawful retaining was partly closed by interpreting it strictly. And although lawful retaining was allowed to continue, it was recognised that it should not be misused. The 1504 Act was harsher than his predecessor because it omitted and got rid of any ambiguity, and it got rid of the ambiguous clause on lawful retaining and laid down much stricter methods of enforcement. And therefore this is highlighted by historians to prove that, particularly in the 1504 law, he did take a much harsher and a different approach to previous kings. All of these things, again, if we compare the 1487 and 1504, you should be trying to think about the patterns, what we said about continuity and change, about this idea of stability and then renewed instability at the end of his reign. So try and think about the wider context of what else is happening in 1504, which might have made Henry feel particularly vulnerable. Okay, so evidence of Henry's success in curbing retaining is seen in the reduction of numbers of retainers that were kept across his reign. Those that did break the law were found out and were made examples of. One of the best examples is in 1506 with Lord Abergavenny. He was fined the statutory £5 per month per retainer, which for him amounted to the huge sum of £70,550. Now, we could argue that he was dealt with particularly severely because of his involvement in the Cornish rebellion. But I think one of the biggest differences, which is really important when assessing retaining, is the difference between Edward and Henry, Edward IV that is, and that can be seen in the way that Henry reacted to his friends. So whereas Edward turned a blind eye towards any misdemeanours, Henry treated everybody alike. So among those that were charged for the crime of illegal retaining in 1504 was the Duke of Buckingham, the Earls of Derby, Essex, Northumberland, Oxford and Shrewsbury, and even the King's mother, Lord Margaret, Countess of Richmond and Derby. One of the most celebrated victims of the King's displeasure over retaining was the Earl of Oxford, a friend and a highly valued advisor. So it seems here that Henry takes a much more uniformed approach. It could highlight his vulnerability, it could tell us a lot about his personality, his style of leadership, and the powers that he held and the way that he used them. According to Francis Bacon, in his history of Henry VII's reign, written in 1622, the king complimented the Earl for putting on such an impressive show in honour of his visit. This is the Earl of Oxford, and promptly he fined him £10,000 after his visit to the Earl of Oxford. So retaining continued well into the reign of Elizabeth. So Henry certainly did not eliminate the practice, but he controlled it to a far greater extent than his predecessors, and he prevented it from becoming a significant problem.